So my paper emerged out of the question of what's there left to say about queer and Eurovision. And in a way, I felt like, since we know this has been such a formative question for the field of European studies for by now 20 years, that it's maybe also an exhausted question in some ways. So what do you do when a question seems to be exhausted? You historicize it. And this is what so there is a little bit of an, archiving, historicizing gesture here in my project. I've been, as Sebastian has just presented, involved with queer Eurovision research for 20 years. What I'm presenting here is also not so much a in-depth research paper, but more an outline of a book on queer Eurovision that I've never written. I'm not sure whether I'm still going to write it. I don't know, but this is like a concept or a mapping of the territory of queer and Eurovision. So this paper proposes a temporal model of queer culture in Eurovision. And by culture, I refer to the complex interplay between performances on stage and their reception by queer audiences, both privately and professionally, which in turn contributes, of course, to the shaping of Eurovision itself. And I'm saying this up front because in this model, queer kind of travels, yeah? So it travels from the body, beyond the body, from the private to the public, from critical to commodified contexts, from social and political engagement. This model proposes a periodization of queer Eurovision across 6 phases, and I'm going to say a little bit more about these 6 phases in a second, each defined by a particular configuration of aesthetics, fandom, and critical and political discourse. One of the leading questions that traverses these different periods is the relationship between aesthetic pleasure, on the one hand, and the production of political meaning. While it is possible to see early Eurovision more in the light of camp pleasure and recent Eurovision through political conflict, I do not want to establish a clear-cut position here based on an understanding of camp as apolitical, that it's, as we know, how Susan Sontag defined it in the early 1960s, and that also constitutes one of the central debates within queer studies, about the politics of camp. So that on the one hand versus politics on the other. From the moment it entered critical discourse around 1990, as both an analytical and political category, queer was valued for its mobility. Yeah, that's kind of the paradoxical definition of queer. A lack of fixed essence and political referent was part of the term from the beginning, since queer theory defined itself through the critique of essentialism, particularly the essentialisms associated with sexuality and gender. The directions taken by queer theory, beginning with the AIDS crisis, were often shaped by social and political urgency. So queer moves there where we have political urgency, and this defines the development of queer and what queer can encompass. These urgencies also motivated the various transformations the concept of queer has undergone over the past 35 years. I should probably also say, this project, the way I think about it, is not only an analysis of Eurovision, but it's also really a history of queer. So I'm really interested in this dialogue, how not only queer can help us to understand Eurovision, but how also Eurovision can help us understand the history of queer. It goes in both ways. At the same time, contemporary cultures and critical projects that identify themselves as queer diverge significantly from another. Queer activists and academic communities do not always agree on what constitutes an urgent project or what the central task of queer engagement should be. And I'm thinking here, for example, on Halberstam, Eng, and Munoz on the one hand, and Tim Dean on the other. As a result, we can no longer rely on a single uncontested notion of queer that would stabilize our critical or political perspective. All right, so here's my model. And I'm really interested also, in comments and critiques on how this is possible. So I suggest 6 phases here. The first one, a proto-queer childhood. And, I think about this and at the same time as, say, historical moments of Eurovision and Eurovision research, but also on a certain level on a, as a question of biographies and generations. So I'm talking here about a proto-queer childhood referring to the 1950s and 60s of the contest, the idea of camp as a secret code, particularly, what Sontag also understands as naive camp, the 1970s and to the 1990s probably. Then, of course, and that's the phase that has been most commented on and researched in queer Eurovision studies. Eurovision's coming out, a deliberate camp phase where camp is evident, becomes a strategic tool of Eurovision, referring to the 1990s and 2000s. Then we also have the effect of mainstreaming of camp, where camp became ubiquitous and not necessarily linked to a queer subculture anymore, talking about the 2000s and 2010s here. And then we have a major shift, and I'm going to say more about all these phases and shifts in a second, in the 2010s and 2020s, where queer was more understood as a social justice project, and I'm saying here beyond sex, where sex and gender were really not the main concern of queer anymore. And that's both the case academically and I think also, specifically in some of the Eurovision research. And as the phase we are currently in, I'd say queer as political activism concerning geopolitical conflicts, talking about the 2020s. So these would be the major distinctions that I'm making. And to clarify what distinguishes these phases, it is useful to think of them across four interrelated levels of analysis. In any given phase, one of these levels may be more prominent than the other. First, there is the institutional history of Eurovision itself over the 70 years of its existence. Second, there is the aesthetic dimension, particularly the history of camp, from naive to deliberate to commodified and generalized camp. Third, there is the social history of Eurovision fandom, the biographies of queer fans of a certain generation parallel the coming out of Eurovision itself. And finally, there is the level of critical and political discourse, the evolution of writing about Eurovision from journalism to academic scholarship and to more differentiated debates within queer studies. So in what follows, I briefly characterize each of these 6 phases, and I also have a conclusion here. In this phase, talking about the 1950s to 1970s, to my knowledge, and again, I'm happy if anybody here in the room has knowledge, has access to knowledge or data or information or literature that I haven't seen yet. In this phase, there was no openly gay or queer fan culture surrounding Eurovision. Did queer people in Europe, at a time when the contest was largely broadcast only within Europe, apart from Israel, gather around television sets in order to celebrate Eurovision together? I don't know. That's a true question. Did gay bars organize Eurovision viewing for their guests? Again, that's to me a real question, So methodologically, since there's so much uncertainty about this phase, this means, so how do we approach that? And I have basically 2 ways of approaching it. One would be more theoretically, and I'm thinking here, I've mentioned this here, the books by Heather Love, David Halperin, and D.A. Miller. So the books by Halperin and Miller, they are mostly concerned with, classical gay queer topics like Hollywood melodrama or Broadway musical. So they speak about the questions of what's the attachment, particularly of queer kids and queer adolescents, to these aesthetic forms. How come that, even after Stonewall, that's David Halperin's question, Broadway musical or melodrama, Joan Crawford, is still so important and significant to queer kids and to gay kids that grow up. Yeah, and I think a similar question can be raised for Eurovision. What is it about Eurovision? The semiotic affluence of Eurovision, the somehow structural queerness of pop culture in general, et cetera, et cetera. So these are ideas that are circulating within Miller's and Halperin's writing. Heather Love is interesting to me because Heather Love has done this work for particularly lesbian biographies in the 1950s in the US context, where she asks the question, how can we think about a queer history if we do not have institutions, if we do not have a public? So how did private spaces and the affective repertoire of private spaces contribute to queer history? And how is our queer moment now linked to those affective repertoires of the 50s and 60s? And she also tries to move away, say, from a schematic model of repression versus liberation, but takes these private effective repertoires very seriously. So this would be a project, again, translating it somehow from the US popular culture context to Eurovision that I'd be very interested in. That would be the theoretical side. The other part of it is, and I think I'm going to say more about this, yes, in the next section. So yeah, let me move on to the next section here, which I call, oh my God, already, okay, I'm going to speed up, which I called Camp as a Secret Code, which is basically a quote from Susan Sontag. I'm relating this to the 1970s and 80s, Sontag's text notes on camp. So, this is to me the idea that there is a knowledge about Eurovision as a queer event, which circles in subcultures, even though it's not like publicly acknowledged yet, for example, by mainstream media. And now I'm gonna jump here a little bit. And the next phase is probably, I don't have to say much about that because that's really the part of queer Eurovision history that is the best researched. It's coming out with Dana's win in 1998. We have Slovenia's Sestre following in 2002. So camp aesthetics are very visible on the Eurovision stage. They become part of the brand of Eurovision. And this is also linked, of course, to social and political movements. It's linked to a certain evolvement and consolidation of the European Union. It's linked to the abolishment of anti-queer and gay rights legislation within Europe, for example, in Germany in 1994, when the Paragraph 175 was abolished. And it's also, what a lot of people, including Robert Tobin and Ivan Rykov and others have talked about, is queer patriotism, European citizenship, or queer nationality. So where this visibility of queer also led to a different sense of community and a form of cultural citizenship, a cultural queer European citizenship. Of course, it's also the period of the emerging academic research on Eurovision around that time. All right, so I already mentioned we then have a moment of the mainstreaming of camp, where camp lost some of its political edge and critical value and became a commodified form, which was generalized. This has also media technological implications. How camp is such a, for example, with my students, for me, camp is one of the most complex and difficult things to talk about. They intuitively know what it is. They from their media literacy on TikTok and whatnot, they know what camp is, even if they don't use the word. They understand the value of these exaggerated forms of mediated aesthetics. All right, so we have the mainstreaming of camp. I do want to say a little bit here more about the next phase, queer as a social justice project, that what it says here, beyond sex. Because in a way, in the 2010s, queer studies really moved away from a certain interest in investigating queer aesthetics. This has a lot to do with this essay by Munoz, Halberstam, and Eng, What's Queer About Queer Studies Now? In a nutshell, the critique was that queer studies until then has been nothing but a self-indulgent project of the analysis of gay, white cis men's sexualities, and we should definitely, true to the sense of mobility that queer entails, move to other areas of research if we want to keep queer in a critical sense. This has a lot to do with the post 9/11 situation in the United States, branching out to post-colonial studies, to trans studies, etc., and understand queer in this larger project. All right, and one of the people in the context of Eurovision studies that has followed that route is, of course, Catherine Baker. But I also see Paul's work, even if it's not explicitly talking about queer, in this branching out to post-colonial analysis, in this idea of extending the critical scope from queer to other areas, sometimes included into what we still call queer and sometimes not. All right, and then we have, of course, our last phase here, which I called queer politics and geopolitical conflict. So the question of what constitutes a relevant political project for queer activism gained renewed urgency following Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th and Israel's subsequent massive military response in Gaza. Within queer academic and activist communities, many argue that contemporary queer critique must incorporate a post-colonial perspective. For some, the history and founding of the Israeli state, including the question of settler colonialism, must be analyzed through such a lens. Others emphasize the long Jewish presence in the Levant, the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, including the Holocaust, as well as continuing anti-Semitism in parts of the Middle East. So this is the debate we are in right now, as all of us are very aware of. The queer Eurovision community, fans, journalists, and scholars alike, appear deeply divided over these issues. Some have distanced themselves from the contest, while others remain supportive of Israel's participation. All right, so my conclusion, which is really quick. In the earliest phase, queer engagement with Eurovision existed largely in private and effective registers embedded within family viewing practices and only occasionally visible within subcultural practices. With the emergence of camp as a shared aesthetic language, Eurovision became legible to queer audiences as a form of coded cultural pleasure. During the 1990s, the contest itself increasingly embraced the association, leading to what might be described as Eurovision's own coming out. The following decades witnessed the mainstreaming and commodification of camp, transforming what had once been a subcultural sensibility into a recognizable feature of Eurovision's global brand. At the same time, shifts within queer theory and activism gradually reframed the meaning of queer itself, expanding it from a critique of sexual norms to a broader social justice project addressing multiple forms of marginalization. The most recent phase reveals yet another transformation, the increasing entanglement of Eurovision with geopolitical conflict. In this context, queer discourse has become a site of political contestation, reflecting broader divisions within contemporary queer activism and academia. The debates surrounding Israel's participation in Eurovision illustrate how questions of sexuality, nationalism, colonialism, and historical memory intersect in ways that puts queer culture at Eurovision itself in a crisis. Thank you.